Dale Prosser had worked the graveyard shift on the Meridian Star for going on 2 years, which meant he'd spent something like 700 nights alone in a windowless room 3 decks below the bridge, watching 41 camera feeds cycle across 6 monitors, while 8,000 people slept above him. The job was mostly stillness. A drunk couple arguing outside a cabin door. A crew member sneaking a smoke on a service deck where smoking wasn't allowed. A kid wandering the atrium in pajamas because the engine noise kept them up. At 3 a.m. on the 5th night of a 7-night Eastern Caribbean loop, none of that was happening, and Dale was on his second coffee, doing the routine sweep he did every hour, camera by camera, when camera 914 stopped him cold. Deck 9 aft. The stern rail, open sky behind it, the wake glowing faint green under the floodlights, and a man standing there, not moving, hands loose at his sides, facing out over the water like he was watching something specific out in the dark. The problem was that Deck 9 aft had been roped off since 8 that evening. The teak decking back there had just been resurfaced, new stains still curing, and the closure was marked with a chain, 2 laminated signs, and a line in the night orders that housekeeping and security both had to initial. Nobody should have been able to get back there, let alone plant himself at the rail like he'd been standing there all night. Dale did what he'd been trained to do, which was not panic and not assume. He zoomed in, got nothing useful. The resolution at that distance, turning the man into a soft gray shape. Dark jacket maybe. No face he could make out. He checked the timestamp against his own watch. It matched. He checked that the feed wasn't looped or frozen by watching the wake move behind the man, the water shifting frame to frame, completely live. Then he picked up the radio and called Able Seaman Reyes, who was 2 decks up doing rounds. "Reyes, I need you to swing by Deck 9 aft. I've got someone at the stern rail back there, past the closure." Reyes's voice came back scratchy through the handset. "That area's chained off, Dale. Nobody's supposed to be back there." "I know. That's why I need you to check." It took him 4 minutes to get there, which Dale timed without meaning to, watching the empty corridor camera outside the closure the whole way. Reyes appeared on screen, flashlight up, and rattled the chain to confirm it was still latched. Then he leaned over it and shone the light down the length of the deck. "Dale, there's nobody back here. Deck's empty. Chain's still locked. Varnish is still tacky. Nobody's walked on it." Dale looked at the other monitor, the one still showing camera 9-14, and the man was still there, still standing at the rail. Reyes was maybe 30 feet from him in the frame, close enough that his flashlight beam should have swept right past him, and the man didn't react to the light at all, didn't turn, didn't flinch, just kept facing the water like Reyes wasn't there. Dale counted it later, going back over the recording. 11 seconds of the man remaining on screen after Reyes reported the deck as empty, before the shape simply wasn't there anymore. Not walked off, not faded like a bad signal. Between one frame and the next, gone. He ran the diagnostic anyway, because that was the job. Because 99% of the time, a strange shape on a low-light camera was a compression artifact or a lens flare off wet decking, and the system would tell you that in about 90 seconds. It came back clean. No dropped frames, no signal interference, no flag on that camera at all. Whatever had been recorded the same way everything else on that feed had been recorded, at the same frame rate, same exposure, same everything. So Dale did the next thing security does when a body shows up somewhere it shouldn't, which is check who it could have been. He pulled the passenger manifest and ran it against the boarding photos, even though the image quality was bad enough that a match would have been generous. Nothing close. He pulled the crew roster next, in case it was someone off duty who'd wandered somewhere they weren't supposed to be. Nothing there either. Then, because it nagged at him, he pulled the keycard access log for the aft stairwell that fed onto Deck 9, the only route back there once the elevator lobby was gated for the night. 0 entries. Not one card swipe. Not one override. From the moment the deck closed at 8 until Dale's own supervisor badge opened it the next morning for the resurfacing crew. Nobody had gotten back there, and somebody had been standing at that rail. He wrote it up straight, the way you're trained to. No speculation, just what the cameras showed and what Reyes had reported, and he handed it to Staff Captain Holt at the shift changeover. Holt read it standing up, coffee in one hand, and Dale watched his face for the reaction you'd expect. Confusion, maybe irritation at a mystery landing on his desk at the start of a long day. Instead, Holt just nodded, slow, like he was filing it somewhere it had already been filed before. "Log it as a system anomaly," Holt said. "Camera glitch. Happens on the low-light units sometimes." "The diagnostics came back clean, sir." "Log it as a system anomaly," Holt said again. Same flat tone, and walked off toward the bridge before Dale could ask him anything else. It was the way he'd said it. Not dismissive exactly, rehearsed, like a phrase he kept in a drawer for exactly this situation, which meant this wasn't the first time the drawer had been opened. Dale let it sit for 2 days, mostly because he had 11 other things on his plate, and because a man doesn't want to look paranoid to his own chief. But on his third night back, before his shift started, he used his access to the ship's central archive, every camera on the vessel, searchable by unit number, going back as far as the storage arrays held footage, and he pulled everything tagged to camera 9-14, not just this cruise, every cruise. There were 2 other hits, both at the stern rail, both a man standing motionless, same rough build, same stillness. One from 4 months earlier, time-stamped 3:04 a.m. The other from 7 months before that, time-stamped 3:11 a.m. Different cruise numbers, different weeks of the year. No obvious calendar connection between the 3 dates at all. But the hour lined up close enough that it couldn't be coincidence. And Dale sat there in the archive room with the hair on his arms, standing up in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He pulled the shift logs for those 2 nights next, expecting to find whoever had been on his console back then, and maybe compare notes. Both nights were blank, not missing footage. The video was right there, but the officer's written shift report, the one every security watchstander files at the end of every night documenting anything unusual, simply didn't exist in the archive for either date. 2 nights out of 2 straight years of nightly reports, and those were the 2 that had vanished. Dale checked the duty roster to see who'd been on console those nights and found 2 different names, neither of them familiar. He asked around in the crew mess the next evening, casual, like he was just curious, and one of the longer-tenured stewards remembered one of them. A security officer named Petrosky, quiet guy, decent at his job. Petrosky had put in his resignation less than a week after that first sighting, packed out at the next port, and left without collecting his final settlement, which on a ship, where crew fight over unpaid hours like it's oxygen, was about as strange as a resignation could get. Nobody had a forwarding number for him. Nobody had heard from him since. That was enough to push Dale past curiosity and into something closer to obsession, quietly, without telling anyone. He started digging into the ship herself, not just the footage. The Meridian Star was 5 years into her current name and flag, but ships like her rarely start out as themselves. A hull number search against the IMO registry took him 20 minutes and turned up something he hadn't expected. This hull had sailed for 11 years before Palisade Cruises bought her out of a bankruptcy auction, refit her top to bottom, and renamed her. Her original name had been the Corinthian Wave, operated by a company called Sovereign Atlantic Lines that folded not long after the sale, absorbed and dissolved so thoroughly that almost nothing about her old service history survived in any public record. Almost nothing, but not nothing. Maritime incident filings don't disappear just because the company that filed them does. And after 2 more nights of searching through flag state casualty databases, Dale found a short entry from the Corinthian Wave's final years of service. A passenger reported missing during an overnight watch, presumed to have gone over the stern rail, no body recovered. Case closed as an accidental loss at sea. The location given for the last confirmed sighting was Deck 9 aft. It should have felt like an answer. Instead, it felt thin. A passenger going overboard on a cruise ship is not a quiet event. There's a full stop of the vessel, a Coast Guard notification, a search pattern that can run for a full day, an insurance claim, usually a lawsuit from the family that drags on for years and generates a mountain of paperwork. This filing was 2 paragraphs, no name, no follow-up documents anywhere in the database, no press coverage Dale could find from a search that should have turned up something if a megaship had genuinely lost a paying guest overboard. Whoever had gone into the water that night, the company had handled it fast, and handled it small, in a way passenger deaths at sea almost never got handled. He noticed something else while he was staring at the 3 timestamps side by side, something he'd missed because he'd been thinking about it wrong. He'd been looking for a calendar pattern, an anniversary, and there wasn't one. But when he pulled up the itineraries for all 3 cruises, this one and the 2 from the archive, and counted the days from embarkation instead of the date on the calendar, all 3 sightings had happened on day 5 of the loop, not the same date. The same day of the voyage, every time, regardless of what month it fell in, which meant tonight, the night he was currently standing watch, was day 5 of this cruise, the same day it had happened on twice before. He was sitting inside the exact window when it had occurred every previous time, and there was nothing on the schedule that made that a coincidence. He went to Chief Security Officer Danvers with all of it. The archive hits, the missing reports, Petrosky's abrupt resignation, the hull history, the thin incident filing, and for about 10 seconds, Danvers's professional composure actually cracked. He rubbed his jaw and said, quiet, almost to himself, "Every 18 months or so, somebody on this console pulls the same thread you just pulled." Before he seemed to hear what he'd said out loud and shut it down fast, telling Dale to keep his report internal, keep it off the official log, and stop digging into archive footage he technically wasn't cleared to pull without authorization. It wasn't a denial. It was closer to a confession that leadership had been quietly managing this for longer than anyone below Danvers's pay grade had ever been told. Dale didn't sleep well that day. He came in early for his shift that night, coffee in hand, and told himself he was just going to watch, nothing more, log anything he saw, and go home. Deck 9 aft had reopened that morning, the resurfaced teak fully cured. No chain, no closure signs, just an ordinary stretch of open deck like 100 others on the ship, which made what happened at 3:09 a.m. harder to explain away as some quirk of an empty, roped-off space. The man was there again, same rail, same stillness, same soft gray shape the low-light camera couldn't sharpen, no matter how far Dale zoomed. But this time there were 2 passengers actually out on that deck, a young couple leaning on the rail maybe 40 feet down, clearly unaware they had company, and neither of them so much as glanced his way, which told Dale something he didn't want to sit with. Whatever was on that screen wasn't there for them to see. And then, for the first time in any of the footage Dale had gone through, the figure turned. Not toward the couple, toward the camera, toward him. Dale's hand froze on the mouse. The face still wouldn't resolve, distance and darkness working against the lens the same as always, but the posture was unmistakable. A man who knew exactly where the camera was mounted, who had turned to face it deliberately, the way you'd face a person and not a fixture. And then he raised one hand, slow, deliberate, and made a motion Dale recognized in his gut before his brain caught up to it. A flat palm, a short chop down and out, the same rounds confirmation signal every deck officer on every ship Dale had ever served on used to tell a colleague, station checked, all secure, moving on. It wasn't a man standing at a rail anymore. It was a man doing his job, making his round, checking his post, signaling the man in the monitoring room that everything back there was fine, the way Dale had signaled 100 officers over 100 nights of his own career. Then the 11 seconds ran out, same as always, and he was gone. Dale sat with that for a long time before he did anything else. Then he went back into the archive, not for footage this time, but for personnel. Sovereign Atlantic Lines had dissolved, but a defunct maritime company's crew records don't vanish any more than its incident filings do. They get sold, absorbed, archived by whatever flag state authority handled its final inspections. And after 2 more nights of chasing paperwork through channels he probably wasn't supposed to have access to, Dale found a crew roster from the Corinthian Wave's last sailing season. A night security officer named Colman Brennan, employee photo attached. A plain, tired-looking man in his 30s, in a uniform nearly identical to the one Dale wore every night. The same week the incident report listed an unnamed passenger lost overboard off Deck 9 aft, the company's internal payroll ledger, a separate document, filed for entirely different reasons. Nobody ever meant for it to be read alongside the casualty report, listed Colin Brennan as voluntarily separated from the company, effective the same date. No exit interview on file, no forwarding address, no further employment history anywhere under that name. Two documents that were never supposed to sit next to each other told Dale the same story from two different angles. A crew death on a company's own ship on a night watch was cheaper and quieter to bury as an unnamed passenger's accident than to report as what maritime law would have made it. A crew fatality, with its own investigation, its own liability, its own paperwork that doesn't get to stay 2 paragraphs long. Somebody had made that call fast, a long time ago, on a ship that didn't exist anymore, under a company that didn't exist anymore, and the paper trail had done exactly what it was built to do. It had almost worked. Dale didn't write any of it up. He wasn't sure who he'd even give the report to, or what Danvers would do with it besides file it in the same drawer as the last one. He finished the cruise, clocked his hours, went home for his rotation like always. And when he came back for the next loop, he found himself, without really deciding to, marking day 5 on the little paper calendar he kept taped inside his locker, the way you'd circle a court date or a birthday, something you don't want sneaking up on you. He still hasn't figured out what he's supposed to do if it happens again on his watch, whether there's anything to do at all beyond note the time and let the 11 seconds run out. What he thinks about more, some nights, staring at camera 914, with the ship dead quiet around him and the wake glowing faint green in the dark, is Petrosky, who saw it once and was gone within the week, and Colin Brennan, still checking a post nobody assigned him anymore, still signaling all clear to whoever happens to be watching. Dale wonders, some nights, who's supposed to relieve him. I spent 11 years working engine rooms before I stopped going to sea, and there's exactly one watch I still can't put away clean, so I'm going to tell it straight through, the way it actually happened, without dressing it up. I was second engineer on a bulk carrier called the Ironmore, 28 years old herself, Liberian flag, doing a repositioning crossing from Rotterdam to Halifax in January, with no cargo in her, and a skeleton crew, because there was nothing to load or unload along the way. Empty ship in a North Atlantic winter rides high and rolls mean, and we had 18 men aboard instead of the usual 24, which meant more solo watches than any of us liked. I had the 12 to 4 in the engine room by myself most nights, just me and 200 decibels of low-speed diesel, and a control room booth with the glass fogged from the heat difference. Nothing about that first hour felt like anything. Then, somewhere under the roar, I caught a knock. Not a rattle, not a bang. A knock, evenly spaced, coming from somewhere behind the noise the way a second conversation sometimes cuts through a loud room even though you can't make out the words. My first thought was a loose tool rolling in a drawer. So I went looking, because that's the job. You don't get spooked by sound down there. You hunt it down and kill it before it becomes a maintenance problem. I shut off the ballast pump for a minute to rule it out. Still there. Cycled the purifier. Still there. Checked the bilge alarms. The seawater cooling pump. Even climbed up and jiggled the exhaust lagging in case a strap had come loose, and was tapping the funnel casing. One by one I crossed things off the list, and one by one the knock kept going, patient, underneath everything, like it wasn't bothered by what I turned off because it had never come from any of it. It took me almost an hour to notice the pattern instead of just the sound, and once I noticed it I couldn't stop hearing it. It wasn't random. It landed once every roll, right at the top of the ship's swing before she came back down, like something timing itself to the sea instead of to any machine. A loose bolt bangs whenever the ship happens to move it. This was matching the motion itself, every single cycle, tight as a metronome. I put my ear defenders around my neck so I could hear it cleaner, and followed it hand over hand along the hull plating on the port side, aft of the gearbox, tracing it the way you'd trace a leak, until I was sure it was coming from inside the steel itself, not off it. And the second I laid my palm flat on that plate to feel for the vibration, it stopped. Dead stop, mid-roll, like someone on the other side had felt my hand land and gone still. I stood there with my palm on cold, sweating steel for a good 30 seconds, telling myself it was coincidence, thermal contraction, anything. Then I lifted my hand off and stepped back half a step. 4 seconds later, right on the next roll, it started again. I did that twice more, just to be sure I wasn't imagining a connection that wasn't there. And both times it was the same. Hand on, silence. Hand off, knock. That's the kind of detail your brain tries to explain away and can't quite manage. I got on the radio to the bridge and asked the mate if he could feel or hear anything unusual through the deck up there. He said no, told me the old girl always talked in weather like this, and went back to his coffee. I remember standing in that booth afterward, feeling more alone than I had all watch, because now I had something I couldn't explain, and nobody up top who'd even entertain it. Off watch the next morning, tired and a little embarrassed at myself, I went digging through the general arrangement drawings we kept in the workshop cabinet, wanting to know what was actually behind that section of plating. I found 2 versions of the drawing, a decade apart. The older one showed a small void space between the double-bottom tanks, unused, access hatch marked. The newer one, from after a refit, showed the same space blanked out entirely, no hatch noted, like it had been resealed and struck from the record, rather than just left as is. Tucked behind the drawings, somebody had left a loose sheet in handwriting, not typed, just a note that said to leave compartment 4 alone and see the chief before doing anything with it. No explanation, no date past a scrawled year I could barely read. I brought it to Ollie, our chief engineer, who'd been sailing on the Ironmore, on and off for going on 15 years, longer than any other soul aboard. I expected him to laugh it off. He didn't. He got quiet, set his mug down, and told me that every tech who'd stood that watch on a rough crossing over the last decade or more had come to him with some version of the same story, same spot, same rhythm, and that it never once happened in calm water, only when the sea was up. He said it like a man reciting something he'd stopped trying to make sense of a long time ago. Then he told me the rest. Years before I signed on, during a bad winter crossing much like this one, a young motorman went missing overnight. Officially lost overboard, no witnesses, no distress call, just gone by the 4 o'clock watch change. Not long after, the yard did structural work in that same section, and compartment 4 got sealed up for good. No further explanation logged anywhere Ollie ever saw. He said the timing always bothered him more than he let on. What bothered me, once he said it, was that the young motorman had stood the same 12 to 4, alone, on a repositioning crossing with a skeleton crew, doing more or less the exact rounds I'd been doing the night before. The weather didn't let up over the next 2 nights. If anything, it built. And the knocking built with it, not just in time with the roll now, but seeming to answer the wind itself, harder through the worst gusts, and softer in the lulls between them, which no loose fitting on Earth does. By the 3rd night, I couldn't leave it alone anymore. I got the 3rd engineer to stand by topside with a radio and went down with a proper set of tools to actually get that panel open, whatever Ollie's note said. When I got the housing plate loose, I found the retaining bolts already backed off, not seized the way 20-odd years of salt air should have left them, and the paint inside the threads was scored on the inner face, not the outer, the kind of scoring you get when something's been worked loose from inside, not from a wrench turned from outside. Nobody had documented touching that panel in years. Inside, there was no body. Nothing like that. Just what a small closed space holds onto when it's forgotten. A canvas tool bag, gone stiff and gray with corrosion. A crew ID tag. The plastic yellowed, but the stamped letters still legible, and scratched into the steel near the hatch lip, in neat rows. Tally marks. Dozens of them. Grouped in 5s the way you'd count days if you had nothing else to count with. I sat back on my heels in that cramped space, longer than I want to admit, before I picked the tag up. It read, R. Bautista, Motorman. I ran that name against the old crew manifests in the office files that afternoon, and it matched the motorman who'd gone missing all those years back. Exact same name, exact same rank. Whatever this had been, it wasn't folklore anymore. It had a name attached to it now, verified in black and white. That night, lying in my bunk before watch, I went back over the recordings I'd started keeping on my phone once things got strange, just holding it near the plating and timing the knocks against the ship's roll on the accelerometer app I'd downloaded out of boredom months earlier. When I lined them up properly, The knock didn't land on the roll peak like I'd first thought. It landed about half a second after it, every single time, on every recording, regardless of who was on watch when I'd made them. Not caused by the roll. Timed to it, deliberately, a beat behind. The way you'd clap along to something after you've learned its rhythm, rather than being knocked into motion by it. That half-second gap sat wrong with me in a way the sound itself never had. With the panel already open, I went in properly, with a light and a hammer, to sound the surrounding steel the way you check for wastage, tapping along the frames on either side of that void space, listening to how the ring changed from solid to dull. 2 frames back from the hatch, the ring went dead flat, the sound of a crack instead of solid plate, hairline but long, running along a weld seam that hadn't been inspected since that old refit, because the compartment had been struck off every inspection schedule since it was sealed. A fatigue crack, real, physical, growing slowly for years, in a section nobody was checking, because nobody was supposed to know it was there to check. I got Ollie down to look at it himself before I said another word to anyone else. He reported it to the master that night, and by morning we'd cut speed and altered course to put the weather more on our quarter instead of taking it head-on, easing the working stress on that hull section until we could get eyes on it properly in port. The classification surveyor who came aboard in Halifax confirmed it was a genuine structural finding, the kind that gets a vessel held for repair, rather than let out to sea again on the same schedule. Whatever had been knocking on that plate for over a decade, on every rough crossing, in that one exact spot, had been knocking on the one piece of steel actually failing. The last night before we made port, the weather finally broke. Seas dropping from a heavy roll down to almost flat inside a few hours, the way the North Atlantic sometimes does, once a system finally clears through. I went down for my watch already knowing, from everything Ollie and the others had told me, that the knocking never came in calm water, not once in 10 years. It didn't disappoint me there, but before it went quiet for good that crossing, I stood with my hand flat against that plate one last time, off duty, off the record, just me and the engine drone, and I heard 3 soft knocks come through the steel, evenly spaced, matching nothing about the sea, because the sea had gone still. When I held still enough to notice, they were matching my own pulse instead, beat for beat, for those 3 knocks and no more. Then nothing. Not that night, not the 2 nights after in port, and according to Ollie, not once on any crossing since, all the way through the repair and every voyage after it. Whatever had been keeping time down there for over a decade, it stopped the same month that crack got welded shut, and as far as I know, on that ship, it never started again. Marisol had been on turnover duty for 4 hours by the time she pushed her cart onto deck 6, and her feet already ached in that specific way that meant she still had 6 hours left. Embarkation day. The whole ship smelled like fresh linen and the lemon disinfectant they ran through the laundry between sailings. And somewhere below her, the gangway was already flooding with new guests dragging suitcases across the marble in the atrium. Her sheet for the day had 31 cabins on it. Cabin 6114 was marked with the code her supervisor had scrawled in the margin months ago and never changed. VAC, do not service. She almost skipped it the way she always did. But her supervisor, Danilo, had radioed her 20 minutes earlier, his voice clipped in a way that wasn't like him, and told her guest services had released a few blocked cabins that morning because the sailing had sold out. 6100 block included. Go check it, he said, and get it turned over fast. We've got a family of 4 boarding at 2. She let herself in with her master key, expecting the smell of a room that had been sealed for months. Stale air, maybe a faint mechanical smell if it really had been on a maintenance hold. Instead, the air conditioning was running. The bed was turned down, the corner of the duvet folded into a neat triangle, the way she'd been trained to do it herself. A paperback sat on the nightstand, its cover soft and worn at the corners, like it had been carried in someone's bag for a long time. In the bathroom, a single towel hung on the rack, still damp enough that when she touched it, moisture came off on her fingers. For a second, she just stood there doing the math a normal person does in a normal situation. Someone beat me to it. One of the other girls must have done this cabin already and forgot to update the sheet. She radioed to check. Nobody on her team had touched 6114. Two of them said it flat out. That room's been blocked the whole contract. Nobody services it. Don't even bother trying the door. She stood in the doorway holding the radio and looking at a towel that was still wet from someone's shower, in a cabin that, according to every piece of paper she'd been handed that morning, had not had a single guest in it for the entire 2 weeks of the cruise that had just ended. She pulled up the manifest on her handheld, out of habit more than suspicion, expecting a glitch, a typo, something boring. 0 occupancy. The whole sailing. Cabin 6114 was not just empty that morning. The system had it down as unsold, unassigned, untouched, for 14 straight nights. She read it twice. Then she looked back into the room at the dent in the pillow. She called Danilo directly this time instead of the group channel, told him what she'd found, waited for him to sound as confused as she felt. Instead, there was a pause just a beat too long before he told her to close the door, skip it, mark it complete on her sheet and move to the next cabin. He'd deal with it himself. Not curious, not surprised, dealing with it. Like this was a recurring maintenance issue and not a bed that had clearly been slept in by someone the ship's own records said didn't exist. She did what he said. She had 30 more cabins, and a family of 4 coming at 2 o'clock. But she kept catching herself thinking about the damp towel for the rest of the shift, the particular unfairness of being told to unsee something so specific. Her keycard stopped working on that door 2 days later. She noticed because she'd been sent to grab a missing luggage tag from a neighboring cabin, and, out of something she couldn't fully explain to herself, swiped it against 6114 on her way past. Access denied, the little light blinking red. Every other door on her section opened for her without hesitation. Someone had gone into the system after that first morning and pulled her clearance from that one room specifically, which meant someone had gone into the system at all, which meant this wasn't a glitch anyone was scrambling to fix. It was being managed. She found out how a few nights later, on her way back from the crew mess, after a late dinner. The crew corridor on deck 6 ran behind the guest hallway, and she was cutting through near the linen closet when she saw Danilo let himself into 6114 from the guest side. No cart, no radio clipped to his belt. He looked both ways down the hallway first, the kind of glance a person gives when they don't want to be seen doing something completely ordinary, and then he was inside, and the door clicked shut behind him. She didn't say anything to anyone about it for almost a week. Then one night in the crew mess, one of the older stewards, a Portuguese man named Adaio, who'd been with the company almost 15 years, had a couple of beers in him, and got talking about ships he used to work, crew he used to know. Somebody mentioned Danilo's name in passing, something about him requesting Deck 6 every single contract for as long as anyone could remember, and Adaio said, almost to himself, "Course he does, since the Reyes girl." Then he caught the look on the face of the younger steward next to him, and he changed the subject so fast it was like watching someone slam a door. Marisol asked around after that, carefully, the way you ask about something you're not supposed to be asking about. Nobody gave her a straight answer. But a few days later, doing an unrelated favor for the housekeeping office, sorting old turnover sheets that needed to be boxed up for storage, she passed the crew corridor bulletin board, where they pinned photos from crew parties and staff of the month announcements going back years, curling at the edges under old tape. She found a group photo from what looked like a Christmas crew party, 6 years old by the date scrawled on the back. A young woman in a housekeeping uniform stood near the end of the row, laughing at something out of frame, and underneath someone had written her name, Elena Reyes. Marisol went back through the later newsletters pinned nearby, the ones from the following months. Elena Reyes wasn't in any of them. Not the next Christmas photo, not the crew of the quarter board, nothing. She'd simply stopped appearing, the way people do when they finish a contract and go home. Except when Marisol found the crew roster archive later that same afternoon, still in the office on an unrelated errand. Elena Reyes's file wasn't marked contract completed. It was marked resigned, mid-contract, with a departure port that didn't match any of the ship's usual turnaround cities, and a date that snagged in her memory because it sat only 3 days before an internal incident report she caught half a glimpse of in the same folder, before the office manager came back in and asked, not unkindly, what exactly she was looking for. She didn't get to read the incident report, but she'd seen enough of the header to know it referenced Deck 6, and she'd seen enough of the resignation letter to know the signature on it didn't look anything like the loose, looping handwriting on the back of that old Christmas photo, where somebody, Elena herself maybe, had written a joke about someone's Santa hat. She worked up the nerve to ask Danilo directly about 2 weeks after that, catching him alone in the linen room during a quiet stretch of the afternoon. She didn't accuse him of anything. She just said she'd seen the cabin, and the manifest, and that none of it made sense to her, and did he know anything about it? She expected irritation. What she got instead was fear, quick and total, crossing his face before he could smooth it away. The look of a man who has spent a long time making sure a particular question never gets asked out loud, and has just watched it happen anyway. He told her, very quietly, that some cabins on this ship had histories, and some histories weren't hers to go digging through, and that she should focus on her own sections. 2 days later, her supervisor rotation changed and she was reassigned off Deck 6 entirely for the rest of the contract. Her contract ended 6 weeks after that. She signed off in Barcelona with the rest of the disembarking crew, flew home, told her sister some vague version of the story over dinner one night. A haunted cabin, haha, and mostly managed to convince herself, over the following 2 months at home, that it belonged in that category of things that happen on ships and don't need explaining, the way sailors have always had stories like that. When crewing called about her next contract, she specifically told the recruiter she'd prefer a different vessel if one was available. The recruiter said she'd note it. 3 weeks later, Marisol's new contract letter listed the Meridian Odyssey again. Same ship. Because that was where the staffing gap was, and that was where they needed her. And preferences, it turned out, were suggestions, and not promises. She told herself it would be fine. She wasn't even assigned to Deck 6 this time. Her new section was 3 decks up, guest cabins on the port side, nowhere near 6114, for the first few weeks of the contract that held. Then, on a Tuesday during a sold-out Mediterranean sailing, one of the Deck 6 girls came down with a stomach flu, bad enough to need medical isolation, and the floor supervisor pulled Marisol to cover the section for the week, because she already knew the layout from her last contract, and there wasn't time to train anyone else. Her sheet that Tuesday morning had 61-114 on it, not marked vacant this time, marked occupied, guest checked in, standard service, the little icon on her handheld showing a paid reservation instead of the block code she remembered. She stood in the crew corridor staring at it for a long moment before she understood what she was looking at. The ship had sold out again, revenue management releasing every held cabin, the way it apparently did, whenever the manifest needed the extra beds, the block lifted by an algorithm that didn't know or care what that room meant to anyone, only that it could be sold. Whatever Danilo had built to keep this room quiet, it wasn't stronger than a full ship. She let herself in already half expecting it, and there it still was, bed turned down, towel damp on the rack, and the book on the nightstand. She recognized the cover before she even picked it up. The same soft, bent spine, the same faded title, half the distance to anywhere. She'd noted the page it had been left open to the first time, back on her last contract, mostly out of the same instinct that makes you remember a stranger's face. Page 214. She opened it now without quite deciding to. 214. Exactly. Not close. Not approximately. The same page, folded at the same corner, months later, on a different contract, on a ship that had sailed thousands of miles and turned over hundreds of cabins in between. Nobody had been reading this book. Somebody had simply been opening it to the same place and closing it again, over and over, like a small private habit repeated so long it had worn a groove. She turned the pages a little further this time, careful, the way you handle something that isn't yours, and near the spine, tucked flat where a bookmark might sit, she found a laminated crew ID card gone soft and slightly warped at the edges, from being folded into a book instead of a wallet. The photo on it was younger than the Christmas party picture, but unmistakably the same face. Elena Reyes, housekeeping attendant. The lanyard hole was worn through on one side, like it had been clipped and unclipped 1,000 times before it ever ended up here. She was still holding it when she heard the door open behind her. Danilo didn't shout. He didn't even look surprised. Not really. Just tired. The particular tiredness of a man who has been waiting a long time for the day someone finally caught him. Marisol didn't say anything either. She just held the card out to him, flat on her palm, and watched something in his face come apart that no amount of composure could hold together anymore. He told her the truth standing in that doorway, in pieces, in a voice flattened by however many years he'd spent not saying any of it out loud. Elena was his daughter. She'd worked this exact job, on this exact deck, 6 years ago, during her second contract, the same age Marisol was now. She'd died alone during a turnover shift in that cabin, a heart thing, undiagnosed, the kind of thing that happens to young healthy people sometimes and nobody sees coming. And because the ship was registered somewhere that made investigations slow and expensive and bad for the company's insurance rates, and because a passenger death or a headline about a dead crew member makes for ugly press right before peak season, the paperwork that eventually reached his family said she had resigned, voluntarily, in a port that made no sense for anyone who understood the itinerary. The company had offered a settlement large enough that questioning it felt like a luxury. A laundry supervisor with 2 other kids at home in Cebu couldn't afford. And the settlement had come with a document that meant he could never say her name to a lawyer or a journalist without losing everything, including the only job that had ever paid him enough to send his other children to school. So he'd stayed. He requested Deck 6 every contract, because it was the only place on Earth that still remembered her at all, in a system that had scrubbed her out of every record that mattered. And every time the block held, he turned that cabin down the way she would have turned it down, left the book she'd been reading open to the page she'd left it on the last time anyone actually knew, hung a towel damp because in a strange grief logic that made sense only to him, an empty room with a dry towel felt more like she was gone than a room where it still looked like someone had just stepped out. Marisol stood there a long time after he finished talking, the card still warm from his hand where he'd taken it back. She thought about the manifest that had wiped Elena out of existence in 14 days of paperwork. She thought about her own contract, her own file sitting in the same system, and how easy it would be, if something ever happened to her on this ship, for the same clean, quiet machinery to close the file the same way. No investigation, no headline, just a resignation letter and a departure port that didn't match anything, and a family at home told a story that wasn't true, because the true one cost too much to tell. She didn't report it. She thought about it, turning it over more than once during the rest of that contract, imagining what good it would even do, who exactly it would help, whether digging it back up would only mean losing Danilo his job and erasing his daughter a second time, more completely than the company had managed the first time. In the end, she decided some truths don't need an audience to be true. They just need one more person to carry them. What she did instead, without ever discussing it with him directly, was this. Whenever the ship sold out, and the system spat 6114 back into rotation, whichever contract she happened to be on, she made sure the room looked the way it was supposed to look, before any other housekeeper got there first. Sometimes Danilo had already been in, and there was nothing left for her to do but close the door quietly behind her. Sometimes he wasn't fast enough, and she'd turn the bed down herself, leave the book open to page 214, hang a towel just damp enough. Nobody on her sheet ever asked why that one cabin took her a little longer than the others. Nobody needed to know. The ship kept sailing. New guests boarded every week in Barcelona, dragged their suitcases across the same marble, filled out the same immigration forms, and left again, 14 days later, having no idea that somewhere on Deck 6, in a cabin the manifest would always insist had been empty, someone had been staying the whole time. I was 26 the first time I stood a dawn watch on the Bering Sea, and I want to say up front that I wasn't drunk, wasn't half asleep, wasn't spooked by campfire stories from the older hands, because that's always the first thing people assume when I tell this. I'd been on the Anne-Marie for going on 4 months by then, a 62-foot expedition boat that ran small groups of tourists up along the Alaskan coast to look at glaciers and puffins and the occasional pod of orcas. And I knew that boat the way you know a house you've lived in a long time. I knew which stair creaked. I knew the sound the anchor chain made when it was seated right versus when it wasn't. So when I tell you what I saw that morning, I need you to understand that I wasn't a kid seeing shapes in the fog for the first time. I'd stood 200 watches by then. Easy. It was the first week of October. Water starting to get that iron color it gets before winter really settles in. And the fog that morning was thick enough that our running lights just made two soft smears in it, port and starboard, red and green, like something bleeding slow into wet cotton. I had the 4 to 8, alone on the flying bridge with a thermos of coffee going cold faster than I could drink it, radar sweeping, nothing on it but us, and a long empty stretch of water. Around 5:45, just as the light was starting to go from black to that flat gray it does before sunrise actually shows itself, I caught a shape off the starboard bow, maybe 300 yards, an open boat, low in the water, orange hull, sitting dead still with nobody in it. My first thought, the boring practical thought, was that somebody's tender had slipped loose from a fishing boat somewhere and drifted into our lane, and that I should radio it in before anyone ran it over in the fog. So I put the glasses on it, and that's when the hair on my arms actually did stand up, not because of anything supernatural, but because I read the hull number stenciled on her bow, and it matched one of ours. Not similar. Matched. The exact 5-character code we had painted on our own number 2 lifeboat, the one that lived on the starboard davit, not 40 feet behind me. I remember laughing a little, out loud alone on that bridge, because the obvious explanation was that somehow our own boat had come loose. So I turned around to check the davit, fully expecting to see an empty cradle and a dangling fall line, already running through in my head how I was going to explain that to the captain. But the davit was full. Our number 2 boat was sitting right there in its cradle, lashed down exactly the way the mate had left it the night before. Canvas cover still zipped, still dry. I stood there for a second not understanding what I was looking at, because I had a hull number matching ours drifting off our beam, and our actual boat with that number sitting secure behind me. I grabbed the binoculars again, and the thing was still out there, still just sitting, and for a second I thought maybe I'd misread the paint through the fog, so I went and got Danny, the bosun's mate, who was on his way up for coffee before his own watch. I physically pulled him by the sleeve up onto the bridge, told him to look, gave him a bearing, and by the time he got the glasses up, there was nothing there. Not moving away, not fading into the fog, just gone, the way an empty stretch of water is gone, of everything except itself. Danny thought I was messing with him, and when he realized I wasn't, he got that careful, humoring look people get when they think you might be losing it a little, which honestly might have bothered me more than the boat itself. He hadn't seen anything the whole time he'd been coming up the stairs, hadn't heard an engine, hadn't seen running lights, nothing. I checked the radar log myself an hour later, when the captain came on shift, scrolled back through the previous hour of returns, and there was nothing on that bearing at any point. No blip, no ghost track, nothing for the machine to have missed either. What made it worse was that when I asked the other guy who'd had the 8 to 12 the night before whether he'd noticed anything odd on the radio during the small hours, he said something I hadn't expected. He said around 5 that morning, Channel 16 had gone dead silent for almost 10 straight minutes. No chatter at all, not even the usual crackle of other boats working the grounds nearby. And then, it had just picked back up on its own like nothing happened. He hadn't thought much of it until I asked. Captain Reyes, when I told her, did exactly what I expected a good captain to do, which was take it seriously enough to log it, and not seriously enough to change anything. Fog plays tricks, she said. Water this cold throws off strange reflections. And she'd seen guys on their first bearing season swear up and down they'd seen things that turned out to be nothing but ice fog bending light around a swell. But then she said something that stuck with me more than the sighting itself. She said this wasn't the first time somebody on that stretch of water, right around that same patch off the coast, had reported something like it. Not on our boat necessarily, just in that general run of water. She said it the way you'd mention any other hazard, like a shoaling sandbar, something you factor in and move past. That planted something in me I couldn't shake. So on my next few days off, I went digging through the old logbooks we kept boxed up in the ship's office, going back years before I'd signed on, mostly out of a restless kind of curiosity, rather than any real expectation of finding something. And I did find something, an incident note from 11 years prior, written by a captain who wasn't Reyes, describing almost the same thing, in almost the same words. Empty boat sighted at dawn. Gone by the time a second crew member arrived. No radar contact. Different watch, different season even, but the same rough coordinates. That log entry mentioned something I hadn't known, which was that the Anne Marie hadn't started her life as a tour boat at all. Before Northbound Expeditions bought her second-hand and refitted her cabins for tourists, she'd run for years under a different name, working out of Dutch Harbor for a crabbing and processing outfit called Callaway Fisheries, a company that had gone under in the late 90s, after quota changes gutted half the small operators out there. I hadn't known the boat had a past life at all. Nobody talks about a boat's old name once she's been repainted. I wrote to our operations office, asking for the full lifeboat registration records, mostly to settle my own head, figuring I'd get back some boring confirmation that our number 2 boat had always carried that hull code, and I'd simply misread the paint in bad light. It took 9 days for anything to come back, because apparently maritime registry requests go through an actual bureaucratic chain, and nobody moves fast for a deckhand's curiosity. While I waited, small things kept surfacing that I probably wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't already been paying attention. A supply manifest with a line item that didn't match what actually got loaded. A missing page in an older logbook, just cut out clean near the spine. Then one of the deckhands from the other watch, a quiet guy named Osei who I didn't know well, caught me alone in the galley one night and told me, almost apologizing for it, that he'd seen something too. About 2 weeks after my sighting. Not a boat this time. A light, low on the water, off the same stretch, holding steady for a few minutes before it just wasn't there anymore. He hadn't told the captain. He told me because he'd heard I'd seen something, and didn't want to be the only one carrying it around. When the registry paperwork finally came back, it confirmed the hull number, all 5 characters, letter for letter. And it confirmed that our current number 2 boat, the one sitting secure on our davit the whole time, had a completely different number, one I'd simply never bothered to memorize because why would you memorize the number of the boat that's always exactly where it's supposed to be? The number I'd seen drifting in the fog belonged, according to the registry, to a lifeboat that had been decommissioned and scrapped almost 20 years earlier, and it had never belonged to the Anne Marie at all. It was listed under a different vessel entirely, one that had also run under Callaway Fisheries, out of the same defunct fleet, sold for parts back when the company folded. That should have been the end of it. A clean explanation with no explanation at all. A dead number attached to a scrapped boat that had nothing to do with us. But it needled at me enough that I spent an evening in the library in Kodiak during our next port stop, going through old newspaper microfilm on the Callaway Company, and I found a short article from 21 years back about a crewman lost overboard during a bad squall, while his boat's tender launched during an emergency drill gone wrong. The article didn't name the tender. It didn't have to. I already had the number sitting in my coat pocket on a folded piece of paper. Through a contact of a contact, the kind of connection you only get in a small industry, where everyone used to work with everyone else's uncle, I managed to get a phone number for a retired hand named Hollis Bergman, who'd crewed for Callaway back in those years. He was in his 70s by then, living somewhere outside Ketchikan, and when I called and mentioned the boat's old name and that hull number, there was a long enough silence on the line that I thought the call had dropped. Then he asked me, real quiet, where exactly I'd seen it. I gave him the rough coordinates off our chart. He didn't say much after that, except that the boat had never actually gone down. That after the man was lost, they'd quietly scrapped her rather than keep her in service. That there'd been talk at the time about the launch mechanism failing on its own during that drill, releasing with nobody in it, and that the company had buried the whole thing rather than deal with an investigation. He said a few more things I couldn't get him to repeat clearly, and then he told me he didn't want to talk about Callaway anymore and hung up. I plotted the coordinates he'd been reluctant to confirm against our own charts back on board, cross-referencing them with the old newspaper account's rough description of the squall's location, and they landed within a couple miles of exactly where I'd seen that boat drifting. Not the same to the foot. Water like that doesn't hold still for you to be that precise, but close enough that it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like something with a shape to it, even if I couldn't tell you what that shape was. I never told Captain Reyes about the newspaper article or the phone call, Not directly, but I did mention the coordinates once, offhand, like I was just talking through the old log entries with her. A few weeks later, I noticed our dawn watch rotation had shifted. That stretch of water now getting crossed a little earlier, or a little later, depending on conditions. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anybody would flag as unusual, but enough that I recognized it for what it was. She never said why. The last time I saw it myself was almost a year after the first sighting. Same season, same kind of fog, same stretch of water. And this time I made myself stay perfectly still and just watch, instead of running for anyone. It was there for longer that second time, maybe 40 seconds. Long enough for me to notice a dark patch along the port side near the bow. Not paint, more like an old repair. A patch where the fiberglass had been built back up unevenly. I didn't think anything of it until months later when I dug up a grainy old company photograph from a maritime archive online. A group shot of Callaway crew standing in front of their tenders sometime in the 80s. And one of the boats in the background had that exact same patch, in that exact same place. I filed an official report both times, and both times it went nowhere. Logged and closed with the same conclusion. No vessel located, no distress signal received, consistent with fog-related visual anomaly. The registry still lists that hull number as retired and scrapped, has for going on 20 years now, tied to a boat that by every paper record stopped existing before I was even out of grade school. Nobody's ever given me a version of events that explains how a scrapped boat with somebody else's fleet number ends up drifting off our bow at dawn, twice, in almost the same water, then simply isn't there by the time a second set of eyes gets up the ladder. I still work that stretch of coast most seasons. Different boat now. And every so often on a bad fog morning, I'll catch myself watching the water a little too closely off the starboard side. Half hoping and half dreading, I'll see that orange hull sitting low and still out there again. I've told this story to 3 or 4 new deckhands over the years. Always on a quiet watch. Always when the fog's thick enough that they'll understand why I'm telling it right then and not some other time. None of them believe it all the way, which is fine. I didn't either before it happened to me. But every one of them, without fail, ends up watching the water a little closer after that, especially right around dawn, especially when the fog rolls in, soft and total, and swallows the horizon whole. I did 7 contracts on that route before any of this became something I couldn't explain away, and even now, saying it out loud, I hear how it sounds. Miami out, Cozumel, Grand Cayman, Nassau, Miami back, 4 months on, 8 weeks off, then back on the ship, like nothing had changed, because nothing ever had. That sameness was the whole appeal of the job, if I'm honest. The blocking never changed. The lighting cues never changed. The only thing that changed was the 3,000 strangers filling the seats every single week, checking in on a Saturday and gone again the next one, replaced by 3,000 more who'd never see the show again after that night. I liked that. Nobody in the audience ever came back to catch me on an off night, because there was no such thing as a repeat audience. That was the whole math of the job. The first time I noticed her, a woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back tight, sitting dead center in row C, not clapping through the opening number when everyone around her was clapping. I clocked her the way you clock any face that isn't doing what the rest of the room is doing. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't checking her phone or leaning to whisper to whoever she was with. She was just watching me, specifically me, through the whole first act, and I told myself she'd probably had a long day at the buffet and didn't care much for musical theater. You get faces like that sometimes. You learn to stop seeing them. The second time I saw her, it wasn't the same cruise. It wasn't even the same year. I was 11 months into a completely different contract, different season, a boat that had turned over its passenger list completely at least 10 times since the last time I'd been on that stage. And there she was again. Same seat. Row C, dead center, the exact chair, not a section over, not a row back, same unmoving face. That's the moment it stopped being nothing, because there was no version of the math that made her a repeat guest on the same specific week, of the same specific year, twice in a row unless she'd planned it. And even then, why that seat? Why that stillness? I mentioned it to Priya, one of the girls I bunked near, halfway joking, The way you joke about something that's already started to bother you more than you want to admit. She'd been standing in the wings with me both times. She said she hadn't noticed anyone like that at all. Not the first time, not the second. And she said it in a way that wasn't dismissive. It was genuine. Like she was trying to remember a face I was describing in detail and coming up with nothing. That bothered me more than if she'd just laughed it off. So I did something I probably shouldn't have. I asked a friend in guest services, a guy named Curtis, who owed me a favor from a night I won't get into, to pull up whoever'd been sitting in C-14 on both of those sailings. Just out of curiosity, I told him, just being nosy. He came back a day later looking a little strange and said there was no passenger seated in that section, matching what I'd described, not on either manifest, no repeat guest flag, nothing. He said maybe I had the seat number wrong. I hadn't. It was around the third time I saw her that I started noticing something worse than the seat. She'd aged, not in the soft way people age over a year or two, a few more lines, a little more gray. She looked a full decade older than she had the last time, maybe more. The skin at her jaw looser, her spine curved forward in a way it hadn't been before. Her hands folded in her lap, gone thinner and spottier. I did the math obsessively that night, backstage on my phone, counting the exact number of months between sightings, and it didn't work. 14 months had passed since I'd last seen her. She'd aged like 15 years had gone by. I started keeping actual notes after that. Dates, seat numbers, what she was wearing. Because some small rational part of my brain still wanted to prove myself wrong. Wanted a boring explanation to fall out of a spreadsheet. It never did. Whatever gap existed between how much time had actually passed and how much time her face seemed to have lived through only got wider every time I checked it. There was a woman in the company, Ronnie, who'd been doing this specific route on and off for almost 20 years, longer than any performer I'd ever met, long enough that she trained half the newer stage managers. I brought it up with her one night in the crew bar, careful, testing the water, and I watched her face change before I even got through the description. She went quiet in a way that wasn't confusion, it was recognition. And then she told me to leave it alone. Actual words, leave it alone. And changed the subject to something about the matinee schedule so fast it felt rehearsed. I didn't leave it alone. I caught her alone a few nights later and pushed. And she finally said, reluctantly, that she'd heard something once, years back, about a girl who'd held my exact role before me, who'd had some kind of trouble with an audience member, and who'd left the ship mid-contract, without much of an explanation to anybody, packed her cabin in a day, and was gone. Ronnie didn't have a name for her. She said it was before her time too, something passed down the way crew gossip gets passed down, second-hand, and softened by however many people told it before it got to her. That sent me down to the corridor outside the crew mess, where the company had this tradition of hanging cast photos going back decades. Rows of them in cheap frames along the stairwell, nobody but crew ever used. I'd walked past those photos 100 times without really looking. This time I went through them one at a time, working backward through the years, looking for my role, the second slot lead, the one who does the closing ballad, and about 30 years back, in a color photo gone slightly orange with age, there she was. Not an older version of her. The exact same face I'd been watching from the stage for 3 years. Unlined, dark-haired instead of gray, but unmistakably the same woman, standing in the same costume silhouette my role still wore, 30 years before I ever set foot on that ship. On the back of the photo sleeve, in pencil, someone had written a name and a year. Corey Voss. I didn't know the name. I didn't think anything of it at the time, beyond the fact that it existed, that a person with that name had stood exactly where I stood, decades before I was born, and looked exactly like the woman who now sat in row C, watching me get older while she apparently did the opposite, or something like the opposite, something that didn't follow any rule I understood. I called my mother that week, mostly to hear something normal, and mentioned it almost as a throwaway, this weird thing I'd found in an old photo archive. A woman named Corey Voss. There was a pause on the line that went on a beat too long before my mother asked me, carefully, where exactly I'd seen that name. I told her. She said she didn't know anything about it and needed to go, and hung up faster than she ever had in her life. Voss had been her maiden name. I hadn't said it. She hadn't asked. After a show not long after that, I broke my own rule and went looking for the woman in the house before the crowd had fully cleared, cutting through the side aisle in full stage makeup, trying to reach row C before she could get up. It took me maybe 8 seconds to cross that distance. When I got there, the seat was empty, and there was no way, physically, for a woman that age to have gotten up and moved through a crowd that fast without me seeing her do it. And nobody near that seat remembered anyone sitting there at all that night. Curtis, still owing me, agreed to pull the theater's security footage from that show. A small favor. Quiet. Off the books. We watched it together in the little server room he wasn't supposed to let me into. The footage showed the whole house clearly. Every seat, every face. Time-stamped. Row C, seat 14, was empty the entire show. Not blurred, not obscured. Empty. On a night when I had watched a woman sit in it for 2 hours and stared back at her more than once. Not long after that, the cruise director pulled me aside and offered me the permanent principal contract, the one that would make me the standing lead in that role, instead of rotating through it every few contracts the way most of us did. It was the job everyone wanted. It also meant, I realized only after I'd said yes, that I would be the one holding that exact slot indefinitely. The same slot as the name on the back of that photo, for as long as they'd have me. I went home for a few days before the next contract started, and while I was there I went digging through a box of my mother's things in the garage, looking for nothing in particular, and found a spiral notebook from a period of her life she'd never once mentioned to me. Tour dates. Port names I recognized. Her handwriting, younger, looser. Somewhere in the middle of it, a page about a woman who kept showing up in the same seat, older each time, watching without clapping. My mother had written almost the same words I'd have used to describe it myself. The notebook stopped mid-page, mid-sentence, dated to a day 31 years earlier. No entry after it. No explanation. My mother had left that ship within days of that entry, and, as far as I could tell from anything I found, never spoken about that year of her life to anyone again. Not my father. Not me. I went back to the ship anyway, because the contract was signed, and because some part of me needed to understand what had happened to her more than I was afraid of what might happen to me. The sightings got worse. She started showing up more than once a contract, moving seats within the section, C11, 1 week, C16 the next, but always keeping her eyes on me the entire time, never breaking it, no matter where in the house she sat. One night, near the end of a show, I did something I'd never let myself do before. I left formation 2 bars early during the bow, walked straight into the house while the lights were still half up, and knelt at the end of her row before she could vanish the way she always did. She didn't get up. For the first time in 3 years, she reacted to me at all. She leaned forward, just slightly, and said something under her breath I felt more than heard. 2 words. My name, said the way my mother used to say it when I was small and in trouble. Then the house lights came up fully and she was gone, and this time I didn't chase her, because my legs wouldn't move. The last week of that contract, on the final show, I looked for her out of habit before the overture even started, the way I always did. Row C, seat 14, was empty, and it stayed empty the entire performance for the first time in 3 years. I told myself it meant nothing. I didn't believe myself. 2 days later, still on board, I got a call from my father in the middle of a costume change, which never happens, which is against every rule we're given about phone use during a show. My mother had collapsed at home that morning. By the time I got a signal strong enough to call back, she was already gone. When I checked the time difference later, working it out with a kind of numb, obsessive precision, it landed within the same hour that seat had sat empty. At the funeral, going through her closet with my father, I found a boarding pass tucked into the lining of an old suitcase, dated to one of the exact weeks I'd seen the woman in row C, years before, when I know for a fact my mother was home, because I have photographs of her at my own middle school graduation that same week. The boarding pass had her name on it, Corey Voss, a sailing she couldn't have taken, and somehow had proof of taking anyway. I stepped back from the principal contract after that, took a smaller role for a while, told the company it was for family reasons, which wasn't a lie. Almost a year later, back on a new ship in a new position, training the girl who'd taken over my old slot. She mentioned something to me one night in the wings, half laughing, the way I once had with Priya. She said there was this older woman she kept noticing in the crowd. Same seat every week, no matter the sailing. Never clapping, never smiling, just watching her the entire show. I asked her which row. She said C. I didn't ask anything else. That night, after the house had cleared, I stood in the dressing room a long time, under the bulb lights taking off my makeup, and for just a second, in the mirror, before I recognized my own face looking back at me, I didn't. The walk-in door sealed shut behind me with that same hydraulic hiss it always made, and for about 4 seconds, that was the only sound in the whole freezer, besides the compressor humming over my head, and the hull groaning through another swell. Then I saw it, wedged behind the second shelving unit, pushed so far back into the frost buildup that somebody either forgot it was there or wanted it forgotten, was a case of something that didn't belong on this ship, didn't belong on any ship still afloat, as it turned out, but I didn't know that yet. I just knew my stomach dropped before my brain caught up with why. I should back up. I was the night galley cook on a Gulf run, 3 and 4 night cruises out of a Texas port down to Cozumel and back. The kind of budget outfit that buys a 25-year-old hull from a bigger line, slaps a new coat of paint and a new name on the stern, and sells it as a fresh start. Ship had been renamed maybe 8 months before I signed on. Older vessel, cheap fares, the kind of contract you take because it pays, and you don't ask too many questions about the maintenance logs. That night we were running through a tropical system that had spun up faster than the forecast said it would, and the galley was short-handed, and the chief steward told me to go grab 3 cases of chicken breast out of the walk-in because the morning prep crew was going to need it before we even hit port. Alone, at close to 1 in the morning, ship rolling enough that I had one hand on the shelving the whole time just to stay upright. That's when I saw the box. It was cardboard, but not the kind we used. Ours was glossy, printed with a logo I'd been staring at every shift for 2 months. This box was matte, waterlogged and refrozen so many times the corners had gone soft and warped, like it had been sweating and freezing for years instead of weeks. And stenciled across the side, in the kind of block lettering shipping companies used to stamp everything with, was a name. Not our ship's name, some other vessel's name, painted right there on food packaging that had clearly been sitting in that exact spot for a very long time. I didn't touch it. I want to be clear about that, because people ask. I looked at it for maybe 10 seconds, felt the hair go up on my arms in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, and then I picked up my 3 cases of chicken, and I got out of there. I didn't go back into that walk-in alone again for the rest of the contract. Not once. I made sure I always had somebody else with me, always had a reason to leave the door propped, and I never told anybody why until a few days later, when I couldn't hold it in anymore. I brought it up in the mess during a break, half joking, asking if anybody knew why there was old stock back there with some other ship's name on it. Most of the guys laughed it off, said it was probably surplus from the shipyard, cheap outfit buys whatever's on sale. But one of the older provisions guys, a storekeeper everybody called Tavo who'd been doing this job since before I was out of high school, went quiet in a way that didn't match the joke. He didn't laugh. He just told me, real flat, that some ships carry more than what's on the manifest, and that I should let it go. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say about frozen chicken. I didn't let it go. That's on me, I guess. A couple nights later, on my break, I used the slow satellite Wi-Fi we got for $11 a day to look up the name I'd seen stenciled on that box. It took a while to load, but when it did, I found a maritime registry entry, a merchant vessel with that exact name, decommissioned and sent for scrapping years earlier. Years before our ship, under any name, had even been laid down in a shipyard. There was no way that packaging should have existed on this hull. The dates didn't overlap by any measure. I sat there in the crew lounge rereading it 3 times, because I assumed I'd misread a digit somewhere, but I hadn't. I brought it to the hotel director's office the next morning, expecting somebody to at least be curious. Instead, I got the kind of smile people give you right before they close a door. She told me it was probably leftover shipyard stock, unrelated packaging, nothing worth digging into, and that my job was food safety, not detective work. She said it in a tone that made it clear the conversation was over before it started. and I left her office feeling like I'd been handled rather than answered. So I did what any of us in that department would do when we're bored and suspicious. I went through the inventory manifests, because as galley staff, I actually had legitimate reason to be in those files. And there, buried in a supply delivery log, was an entry dated to a period when our ship, under its current name, was still supposedly sitting in dry dock undergoing its refit, months before its first sailing. A full delivery, logged and signed for, on a ship that according to every other document wasn't operational yet. Somebody had stalked that walk-in before this ship, as this ship technically existed. Tavo found me with those printouts a few nights later and didn't ask what I was doing. He just sat down across from me and told me, quieter this time, that the vessel I was standing on hadn't always worn this name, that the company had bought her under a different registry a couple years back, and renamed her when they brought her into this budget line. On its own, that's not strange at all. Ships get bought and sold and rebranded constantly. It's just business. But paired with what I'd found in that freezer, it started feeling less like coincidence and more like a thread I'd accidentally started pulling. During a lifeboat drill not long after, I got close enough to the hull to actually read the IMO number plate riveted near the bridge wing, the permanent identification number every commercial vessel is supposed to carry for its entire operational life. The one number that's not supposed to change, even when the name does. I wrote it down on my hand like an idiot, and looked it up that night. What came back nearly made me shut the laptop. That IMO number pulled 2 separate vessel histories in 2 different maritime databases, 2 different names, 2 different builders, 2 different fates. One of them was the scrapped vessel from the freezer box. Around that same time, I started noticing something else. Something that had been sitting in plain sight the whole contract. Turnover in our department was brutal, way beyond what you'd expect even for a budget line known for burning through crew. People signing off early, contracts ending without the usual send-off, replacements flown in faster than felt normal. When I asked HR about it, almost joking, they told me every ship has its churn, but our sister ships in the same fleet, ones I'd sailed on before, didn't lose people at anywhere near this rate. I wasn't the only one paying attention by then. A galley steward named Milo, a guy I'd gotten close with over the contract, had started asking his own questions after I told him what I'd found. We compared notes on our breaks, half amused by how deep we were getting into it, treating it like a game, right up until it stopped being one. One week Milo didn't show up for his shift, and when I asked, I was told he'd signed off early in Cozumel. Personal reasons, effective immediately. I went by his cabin anyway, told myself I just wanted to say goodbye. His bunk was still made. His phone charger was still in the wall socket. His rosary was still hanging off the bed frame, the one he never took off even in the shower. People don't leave a ship and forget the thing they touch every single day of their life. I went back to the walk-in after that, thinking if I could just get a photo of that box, something concrete, somebody would have to listen. The shelving unit was gone, not moved a few inches, gone, replaced with a different rack entirely, the whole back section of the freezer rearranged like it had been remodeled overnight during a routine restock. There was no frost buildup where there should have been years of it. Somebody had cleaned house, and they'd done it fast, and they'd done it quiet. A clerk I'd befriended in the ship's admin office, somebody who owed me a favor for covering a shift, let it slip that there was a sealed file in corporate records referencing an incident from years back, tied to what the internal language called an asset transfer between 2 hull identities. She didn't know details, just that it existed, and that access to it required a level of clearance neither of us had. Corporate language like that doesn't show up around ghost stories. It shows up around lawsuits, insurance claims, and things companies pay lawyers to bury. It took a long night of digging through maritime industry forums, the kind frequented by retired engineers and inspectors who like to talk shop, before I understood what I was actually looking at. Ship recycling fraud isn't some rare, exotic thing. It happens more than people realize. A company reports a vessel scrapped, collects on insurance or subsidies tied to decommissioning, satisfies the paperwork trail completely, and then quietly moves that same hull through a chain of shell buyers, reflags it under a different registry, refits it, and reintroduces it to the world as a different, newer vessel entirely. On paper, it's a clean berth. In steel, It's the same ship that was supposed to be cut apart for scrap years earlier. Once that clicked, the freezer box stopped being strange and started being evidence. If this hull had never actually been scrapped, if it had just changed its name and its paperwork while staying the same physical ship, then of course there could be old stock wedged behind a shelving unit that nobody had cleared out properly during the refit. It wasn't a leftover from some other vessel. It was leftover from this vessel's earlier life, before the story about it being new was written. And that meant whatever had happened on that ship under its old name, whatever had been bad enough to fake a scrapping over, had happened right here, on the same steel I'd been cooking on for months. That thought sat with me for days before I could do anything useful with it. Somewhere along the way, this had stopped being a curiosity and started being about real people. If a company goes to the trouble of faking a full decommissioning, instead of just quietly reflagging a ship the normal way, it's usually because something happened aboard her that they could not afford to have connected to their name. People don't fake a ship's death over a paperwork inconvenience. They fake it over a body count. I started looking at the ship itself differently after that, walking the crew corridors during my off hours instead of sleeping, running my hand along bulkheads that had clearly been repainted more than once. In a maintenance passage near the engineering spaces, under a section where the paint had chipped and hadn't been touched up, I found part of an old stenciled name sanded down but not gone, just enough letters visible to match what I'd read off that freezer box. The rivet pattern in that corridor was older than anything else on the ship, mismatched with the newer steel used in the refit sections. It wasn't proof a court would accept, but it was proof enough for me. Through one of those maritime forums, I managed to get in touch, by phone, with a retired marine engineer who'd actually served aboard the original vessel under its old name, years before any of this. I gave him just enough detail for him to understand what I was asking about, and there was a long silence on the line before he spoke again. He confirmed there had been a fire in the aft crew section, late in that ship's original service life, one that killed several crew members before the company moved fast to take her out of service permanently. He said families were paid quietly, told a version of events that didn't quite match what he remembered, and encouraged to move on. He hadn't spoken about it in years. He asked me, before we hung up, whether I was currently on a Gulf route ship with a name he didn't recognize, and when I told him yes, he went quiet again, and just said to be careful. Not long after that call, another galley crew member, one who'd been friendly with Milo, quietly passed me a folded page torn out of a personal notebook, telling me he'd found it tucked into a life jacket locker, and figured it was mine to have, since I'd been the one asking questions. It was Milo's handwriting. A few lines describing a sealed-off section below decks he'd found during a night watch, an area that didn't match any deck plan he'd been given, accessible through an old maintenance hatch that had been welded over on one side but not the other. The last line just said he was going back down to look properly. There was no date after that. I confronted the staff captain about Milo directly, dropped the freezer, the manifests, the IMO discrepancy, all of it on his desk in one conversation, because I didn't have anything left to lose by staying quiet. He didn't deny any specific detail. He just told me, calmly, that continuing to pursue this would end my contract immediately and follow me through the agency that staffed half the ships in the Gulf, that I'd never work another cruise contract again if I kept talking. It wasn't a threat shouted across a desk. It was worse than that. It was delivered like a fact, like something that had been said to other people before me, and had worked every time. I went looking for that hatch anyway, a few nights later, because I couldn't stop thinking about Milo's rosary, hanging untouched on his bunk frame. I found the maintenance corridor Milo had described, found the hatch welded shut on one side exactly like he'd written, and found a way through a service crawl space that ran alongside it instead. What was on the other side wasn't dramatic. It was worse for being ordinary. A row of old crew bunks, bolted down, personal effects still tucked into the frames, a name tag still clipped to a locker door, a faded photograph taped inside it that had survived years of damp air. Real people had lived in that space. Real people, under the ship's old name, and whatever had happened to them, the company had chosen to seal the room shut rather than deal with it properly. 2 nights after that, during another storm rolling through the Gulf, I got sent alone into the walk-in one more time, Late, because we were short-staffed again, and somebody needed prep for the morning. Halfway through pulling cases, the door latch cycled and locked from the outside, something that wasn't supposed to be possible with the safety release, and the compressor kicked into a harder cycle that dropped the temperature fast. I banged on that door until my hands went numb, no exaggeration, and nobody came. I don't know for certain who did it, and I've decided I don't want to know, because either answer is worse than not knowing. What got me out was dumb luck and a maintenance vent duct that ran back toward the engineering spaces. Close enough that when I started hammering a serving spoon against the metal grate, somebody 2 decks over eventually heard the rhythm and came looking. I got off that ship at the next port and didn't get back on. I went to a maritime authority, contact a friend from a previous contract put me in touch with, brought what I had, the photos of the plate, the printed manifest gaps, Milo's torn notebook page, the recorded call with the retired engineer. They took it seriously enough to open a file, which is more than I expected. But the company that owned this ship operated under a flag of convenience, through a holding structure spread across 3 different countries. And every official I spoke to told me some version of the same thing, that jurisdiction was a mess, that the paper trail would take years to untangle, if it ever got untangled at all, that companies like this restructure their ownership chains, specifically to make this kind of investigation take longer than anybody's patience lasts. Nobody told me I was wrong. They just told me it would be slow. And slow, in that industry, usually means nothing happens at all. I never heard anything more about Milo, officially. I think about him more than I'd like to admit. It's been about 8 months since I left that contract, and I still keep an eye on crew forums, partly out of habit, and partly because I never fully let this go, no matter how many people told me to. A few weeks ago, I saw a listing for a new hire on a Gulf route ship, a name I didn't recognize, Budget Line, recently rebranded. Same general routing between a Texas port and the Yucatan coast. I did some digging out of old habit, and the ownership trail led back, through 2 more shell transfers, to the same company. Same hull, as far as I can tell, wearing its 3rd name in under a decade. A few days ago, somebody I don't know messaged me through one of those crew forums. Somebody who'd found an old post I made, warning people to check delivery manifests against build dates before signing a Gulf contract. She said she was new crew on that ship, still in her first week, working galley restock. She said there was something wedged behind a shelving unit in the walk-in that didn't make any sense. Old packaging, frost-warped, a ship's name on it that wasn't her ship's name. She asked me if the name Corsair Dawn meant anything to me. I read that message 3 times before I could make myself answer it, and even now I'm not sure what I'm going to say back. Owen Marsh took the 12-4 watch on the Halden Star, the way he'd taken it for 6 years. Coffee in one hand, the log pen already uncapped in the other, headset warm from the shelf heater beside the chart table. The ship carried no passengers this crossing, only a delivery crew of 19, bringing her back from a refit yard in St. John's to the start of the season in Reykjavik, running light and high in the water, 3 weeks out from her first paying guest. It made the bridge feel larger at night. Fewer footsteps, fewer voices on the radio, just the hum of the gyro repeater, and the sea doing what the sea does along the tail of the Grand Banks in April, which is complain. He noticed the interference before he noticed anything else. 2 nights running, close to 0140, a low double tone bled into the guard band on 2182 kilohertz, on and off, gone inside a minute both times. He logged it as atmospheric both times, because that's what a man writes when he doesn't know and isn't required to know. Skip. Ducting. Something bouncing off a layer nobody can see from the bridge. It happens out here. He'd been told that in his 2nd year, and believed it because there was nothing more useful to believe. On the 3rd night, the tone came back, held longer, then resolved into something with structure. Not static, not skip. A rhythm. 2 frequencies alternating. Clean and mechanical, the kind of signal built to trip an alarm bell, rather than to carry a voice. Owen had read about it in his radio certificate coursework, as a historical curiosity, a system phased out of the industry before he'd finished school. He was listening to it live. Then the tone cut, and a voice came through underneath it, and the voice was giving a mayday the way nobody gave a mayday anymore. The old cadence. The call sign spoken twice. The ship's name spoken once slow and once fast. No digital alert preceding it. No automated distress relay. Just a man's voice reading off a script that predated every piece of equipment on the bridge around Owen. The ship's name was Provost. It wasn't in the fleet database. It wasn't on the AIS overlay. Wasn't a radar contact. Wasn't anything Owen had ever typed into a search field in his career. What made his hand go still on the pen was the position the voice read out. Not a general area. Not somewhere off the banks. A latitude and longitude close enough to their own that if it was real, whatever was sinking was close enough to see with the naked eye. He called the captain. Halverson came up in his boots and undershirt, listened to Owen's account, and did exactly what Solus required of him, without needing to be told twice. Altered course toward the position, doubled the lookout, brought the searchlights up. For the better part of an hour, the Halden Star swept a box search over open water with nothing in it. No debris, no life raft, no thermal return on the light, no return on the radar that wasn't sea clutter, nothing. Owen tried the callback 3 times on the same frequency, using the call sign the voice had given. No answer. What stopped him cold wasn't the silence. It was that when he pulled up the DSC watch receiver, the piece of equipment that automatically timestamps and logs any distress traffic on the monitored channels, it showed nothing at all in that window. As far as the ship's own automated systems were concerned, no transmission had occurred. He had his own handheld recorder running, a habit from his first captain, who used to say a man's memory is the least reliable instrument on the bridge. The recording was there, but when he played it back against his own log entries afterward, the timestamps didn't sit right. The recorder showed the Mayday voice arriving 4 minutes before the alarm tone that was supposed to have preceded it. He'd heard the tone first. He would have sworn to it. The recorder said otherwise, and the recorder didn't lie the way memory did. Halverson wrote it into the deck log as a probable spurious transmission, equipment anomaly, position investigated, nothing found, search discontinued. 4 lines. He told Owen, not unkindly, to log his hours and get some sleep, and to leave it there. It was the kind of instruction that made sense on paper and didn't sit right in the body. Owen didn't leave it there. 2 days later, waiting out a weather delay off the Newfoundland coast before the crossing proper began, he used the ship's satellite link to search the vessel's name against the fleet's Lloyd's Register subscription, mostly to prove to himself it would come back empty. It didn't. Provost, small coastal packet steamer, lost with all 14 hands, 'cause never established, presumed foundered in heavy weather. The date attached to the loss was decades before Owen had been born. He kept pulling the thread. The alarm tone, the exact procedure the voice had used, the frequency itself as a mandatory distress watch. All of it belonged to a system the industry had retired from service before Owen existed. Nobody currently sailing had trained on it. Nobody hoaxing a mayday for a laugh would have known to reproduce it correctly, down to the cadence. He brought all of it to Halverson privately, in the captain's day room, expecting to be told again to drop it. Instead, Halverson sat with it a long moment, and then, quietly, admitted he'd heard something close to it himself, years earlier, on a different ship, in a different part of this same stretch of water. He'd never logged it as anything but weather. He'd never told anyone. A man gets a reputation fast for the wrong reasons, he said, and reputations follow you into your next contract. It wasn't a confession Owen had expected, and it changed the shape of the thing. This wasn't only strange, it was something men had been quietly declining to report for a long time. With the captain's tacit blessing now, Owen went looking in the company's own incident archive, the internal database every vessel fed into for insurance and safety auditing. Buried under bland classifications, communications equipment malfunction, unidentified radio traffic, he found 2 more entries from other company vessels over the past 15 years, each logged in that same general corridor, each closed without explanation, each filed by an officer who never elaborated beyond the minimum required text. Then he found something closer to home. Pulling the Halden Star's own class society file out of curiosity, checking the hull's build history, he learned the ship had originally been laid down as one of 2 sister hulls, for a shipping company that folded decades ago, Northern Star Line, a small coastal operator that had, among its modest fleet of feeder vessels, once owned the Provost. The hulls had changed hands and names more than once since. The connection wasn't mystical. It was corporate, documented, the kind of paperwork trail that exists for half the merchant fleet afloat. It was also not nothing. He wrote to a name the Lloyd's Register archivist had passed along, a retired coast radio operator turned private collector named Desmond Cray, who ran, out of a spare room in Cornwall, one of the last serious archives of old marine distress recordings on reel tape. Cray wrote back within 2 days. He already had a file on the Provost. A retired coast station operator had handed him a reel decades ago. Allegedly, the station's own copy of the vessel's final transmission, picked up faintly before contact was lost for good. When Cray sent the digitized file, Owen sat in his cabin and put it beside his own recording from 3 nights out of St. John's. The wording matched, almost line for line, the same cadence, the same call sign. Almost. His copy carried one extra sentence that the 60-year-old recording didn't have. Not a garble, not noise. An added line. Clean and intelligible. Whatever this was, it wasn't a fixed recording looping through the decades. It was producing something, and what it produced wasn't always the same. Owen raised the obvious rational explanation with Cray. Long-delayed echo. A real and still unexplained phenomenon in radio history, where a transmission returns years after it was sent, bounced somewhere in the ionosphere and released late. Cray had heard the theory 100 times and didn't dismiss it outright, but he pointed out the hole in it gently. An echo doesn't answer back, and in more than one account he'd collected over 30 years of doing this. From operators on different ships in different decades, the signal had responded. Not exactly, not conversationally, but in a way that tracked something the listener had just said or done. Owen's own callback fit the pattern. He hadn't mentioned that part to Cray. Cray had heard it before from someone else. Back on watch, restless and short on sleep, Owen went further than he'd meant to. Ships are required to retain old logbooks for a set number of years, and the Halden Star's archive locker held bound volumes, going back well past her last renaming. 2 nights before making Reykjavik, going through them mostly to keep his hands busy, he found an entry in a different hand, more than a decade old, describing almost the same night in almost the same words. A Mayday, an old format call sign, a ship's name given as Provost, a search that found nothing. The entry was signed only with initials, R. Aldous. He tried to find Aldous through the crewing office, thinking a conversation with someone who'd actually lived through it once before might settle something. The answer that came back was a dead end, dressed as an administrative shrug. The man had left the company not long after that voyage. The phone number on file was disconnected. The forwarding email bounced. Nobody in the office remembered him well enough to say more. In Reykjavik, waiting on cargo before the return crossing, the second officer, going through a routine cleanup of old electronic chart routes that had accumulated in the Ecdis over several seasons, found a waypoint buried in an unused route file that nobody could account for. No user login attached to it, no creation timestamp that made sense against the system's own audit trail, which under normal operation logs every entry without exception. The coordinates matched, to 3 decimal places, the position the Mayday had given weeks earlier. Owen hadn't put it there. Nobody had a record of putting it there. It simply existed, in a system that isn't supposed to allow anything to simply exist. He asked to swap off the same watch slot for the return leg. Not officially, just a quiet word to Halverson, who granted it without asking why. Neither of them said what they both understood. Owen told Kate on the satellite call that he'd switched to days for a stretch, and left it at that, because there wasn't a version of the real answer that wouldn't have worried her more than the lie did. On the return crossing, in that same window, it was Third Officer Dana Wick on the bridge, and Dana reported a clean watch, nothing on the radio, nothing on radar. It should have ended there. It didn't, because the ship's voyage data recorder, the continuous audio and systems log every Solis vessel is required to carry, picked up a burst of unexplained radio frequency interference in that exact narrow window, logged and time-stamped, whether or not a human being in the room had registered it as anything worth mentioning. The phenomenon, whatever it was, didn't require a listener to be real. It only required someone, eventually, to go back and check. Owen asked the ship's electrotechnical officer to pull the spool. Cleaned up and slowed down by a signal processing contact, Cray put him in touch with. Buried far under the noise floor, there was something resembling a voice. Most of it stayed unintelligible no matter how many passes they ran. 3 words came through clean enough to be certain of. One of them was a name. He didn't recognize it. He sent it to Cray anyway, half expecting nothing. Cray took 2 days to write back, and when he did, his tone had changed. The name matched one of the 14 men lost aboard the Provost. A fireman, 19 years old. A name that had never come up in anything Owen had already been sent. A name Cray himself had only found by digging through a parish muster roll that wasn't part of any public shipping index. The kind of record that takes a specialist and a personal favor to locate it all. Whatever had produced 3 legible words out of a wall of static had reached further into the actual historical record than either of them had, using sources neither of them could easily explain how it would have access to. Nothing else happened for the rest of the crossing. The Halden Star made St. John's, discharged her delivery crew, and Owen flew home to Kate and their daughter for 11 days before his next contract came through, on a different company's ferry, running overnight legs, across a stretch of warm water on the other side of the Atlantic entirely. Nothing like the banks, nothing like the cold. 4 weeks into that contract, on an ordinary watch, in water that had never in its recorded history swallowed anything larger than a fishing boat, Owen had 282 kilohertz live in the background out of a habit he couldn't quite explain to himself anymore, even though the ship's watch requirements didn't call for it. For less than 2 seconds, the old double tone came through, faint, unmistakable, and then it was gone. He didn't alter course. He didn't wake the captain. He didn't write it into the log. He sat with the handset in his hand for a long time, the bridge quiet around him, and understood, without being able to prove it to anyone who hadn't been there, that whatever this was, had never really belonged to that stretch of water at all. The patient who was already dry. The call came in at 7 minutes past 2 in the morning, ship's time, which on the 4th night of a transatlantic crossing means nothing is ever good. I picked up the radio expecting a fall on the casino stairs, or a heart flutter in someone who'd had too much champagne. Instead, I got a steward's voice, flat and trying hard to stay that way, telling me a passenger was down in the corridor outside her cabin on deck 6, soaked through, and could I come now? I grabbed the crash bag out of habit more than need, and went. Deck 6 is nowhere near open water. No promenade, no external doors, nothing but interior staterooms, stacked along a carpeted hallway that smells permanently of recycled air and hot metal. When I got there, she was sitting up against her own door, with her knees pulled in, shaking hard enough that her teeth were audible, and her hair was plastered flat against her skull, the way it only gets when someone has been fully underwater. Her name was Eleanor Voss, cabin 6142, traveling alone. She was lucid enough to talk, which I remember being grateful for, and the first thing she said to me, before I'd even gotten a thermometer near her, was that she'd only stepped out onto her balcony for a moment. She said it twice. She said it like she needed me to understand it wasn't her fault, whatever this was. Cabin 6142 does not have a balcony. I knew that before I even checked, because I know this ship, but I checked anyway, because that's the job. You check the thing you already know. Interior stateroom, no window, no exterior wall at all really, boxed in on both sides by identical rooms. The steward who'd found her, a kid named Petrosian, who'd been doing this route for maybe 8 months, stood in the doorway looking at the room like he expected the wall to have grown a door since his last shift. We got her into the medical bay and I started the workup the way I would for anyone pulled out of cold water, because that's what her body was telling me, regardless of what the deck plan said. Core temperature was 93.4 degrees. That is not a number you get from stepping outside for a moment in a sea breeze. That is a number you get from being immersed, properly immersed, for a stretch of time measured in tens of minutes, not 1 or 2. I cut her blouse open to get the leads on, and the fabric was heavier than wet fabric should be, saturated in a way that reminded me of pulling laundry out of a washer mid-cycle. It didn't smell like the shower. It smelled like the rail at the stern on a rough day. sharp and mineral, and when I got close enough I could see salt starting to crust white along the collar as it dried. I keep a small test kit in the med bay that we normally use to check chlorine and salinity in the two pools topside, mostly because the pool tech is bad about doing it himself. I wrung a few drops out of her sleeve onto a strip out of habit, more than expectation. It read as seawater. Not city water, not pool water, treated with chemicals. Seawater. Cold Atlantic seawater. On a woman who had been, by every physical fact of the ship, nowhere near any of it. I asked her when she'd left her dinner table, because I wanted a timeline. And it turned out I didn't need to ask far. The maitre d' on deck 5 confirmed she'd said goodnight, and taken the aft stairwell up at 1:38. The corridor camera outside her own cabin, routine footage, the kind we only ever pull after an incident report gets filed, showed her badge swipe into 6142 at 1:38 as well. Dry, calm, moving like someone who'd had 2 glasses of wine and was ready for bed. Petrosian found her back in that same corridor, soaked and going hypothermic, at 1:47. 9 minutes. I want to be precise about that, because precision was the only thing keeping this ordinary in my head for as long as it stayed ordinary. 9 minutes is not enough time to get anywhere near open water on a ship this size and get back, even at a dead run, even if every door between here and the nearest exterior deck happened to be standing open. I told myself there had to be a gap in the footage. Cameras die. Storage buffers hiccup. I've seen it happen on this exact system twice this year. So I went and sat with the security officer on duty, a woman named Alcaraz, who has been doing this job long enough to be unimpressed by almost everything, and we watched it together. The corridor cam is fixed on the stairwell end of deck 6, catches every cabin door in that row, including 6142. At 1:38 the door opens. Eleanor Voss walks out, badges in, door closes. Nothing else happens in that frame for 9 straight minutes. No other body enters or exits. At 1:47 the door opens again from the inside, and she comes out soaked to the skin and goes down against the wall almost immediately. Alcaraz checked the timestamp against the ship's master clock, checked the recording for drop frames, checked the drive logs. Continuous. No gap, no glitch, no maintenance window on that unit. She looked almost offended by it, like the system had personally let her down by working correctly. That ruled out the easy answer for me, the boring one I'd been quietly hoping for, and I noticed the particular way my stomach dropped when it did. Not fear exactly, more like the floor tilting a half degree under a very familiar room. I went back to examining her with that sitting in the back of my head, and made myself work the body in front of me, instead of the impossible math around it. No bruising anywhere, no ligature marks, no defensive wounds, nothing to suggest another person had done this to her, held her under a shower or a bathtub as some kind of cruel joke gone wrong. Her lungs had a faint crackle low on the right side when I listened, consistent with someone who'd taken in a small amount of water and coughed most of it back up, rather than someone who'd been fully submerged and drowning. Consistent, in other words, with the ocean, and inconsistent with a hotel bathtub. I sat with her once she'd stopped shaking quite so hard and asked her to tell me again, slowly, what she remembered. She said she'd stepped out onto her balcony because she couldn't sleep, that the rail was cold under her hands, that there was spray coming up off the water hard enough to wet her face before she'd even leaned over it. She described the wind direction. She described a specific sensation of the deck tilting under her, of going over the rail not by choice, but because the ship rolled and she'd been leaning too far. She was not vague about any of this. She was giving me a memory with edges, the kind of detail people don't usually invent, and every part of it described a room that does not exist anywhere on this vessel. It was somewhere around 3 in the morning that Alcaraz, still parked in my office going through the footage a second time out of what I think was professional stubbornness, mentioned almost offhand that this reminded her of something from earlier in the crossing. 2 nights before, a junior engineer had been found in a stairwell near the crew quarters, soaked, cold, written up in the log as intoxication and exposure, and sent to bed with instructions to sleep it off. Nobody had connected it to anything, because nobody had reason to. I pulled that chart. His vitals on intake had him at 95 degrees core temperature. Nobody had flagged it as anything other than a young man who'd had too much to drink and wandered somewhere damp. I don't think that diagnosis was wrong exactly. I think it was just the only explanation anyone had reached for at 2 in the morning, the same way I'd reached for a camera glitch an hour earlier. I asked Petrosian, since he was still hovering around clearly rattled and not eager to go back to his rounds alone, whether anything like this had happened before on this ship that he knew of. He got that particular look crew get when they're deciding whether telling you something will get them in trouble. And then he said, quietly, that the older stewards sometimes talked about it, always around this stretch of the crossing, always at night, and that it wasn't anything anyone wrote down, because there was nothing to write down. Just something that happened sometimes, on this route, on this ship, and got handled quietly and left alone. That sent me looking at the ship's position log instead of the deck plan, mostly to rule it out. Both incidents, the engineers and Eleanor Voss's, had happened while we were crossing the same narrow band of ocean, roughly 40 minutes of transit either side of a specific set of coordinates the ship passes through every crossing on this exact overnight leg. I sat with that pulled up next to the maritime archive our radio room keeps cached for weather and navigation history, and searched the coordinates less because I expected to find anything, and more because I wanted something else to think about besides the footage. What came back was a passenger liner called the Halbrecht, lost in the winter of 1937 with 216 people aboard, in that same stretch of water, in circumstances the record listed only as foundered, cause undetermined. I sat with that a long time before I let myself think about what it might mean, because I am not the kind of person who reaches for that kind of explanation first, and I still am not fully, but it was there, and once it was there I couldn't put it back. I went looking for the deck plans next, the real ones, the structural drawings kept for fire safety and maintenance, rather than the glossy version they hand out at embarkation. I wanted to know what 6142 had been, before it was 6142. It took Alcaraz about 20 minutes on the old refit records to find it. This ship went through a capacity renovation 11 years ago, and a run of staterooms along Deck 6, including that one, had originally been balcony cabins before the line sealed the balconies over and folded the space into the interior layout to add berths. On paper, in the version of this ship that existed before that refit, Eleanor Voss's cabin had a door leading out onto a private rail over open water. I didn't say anything to her about that. I went and stood in the room instead, alone, with Petrosian holding the door because he didn't want to be in there by himself, and didn't want to admit that either. Behind the fabric wall panel on what would have been the exterior side, there was a seam in the wallpaper that didn't quite match the pattern run on either side of it, like a patch job done fast and never revisited. I put my hand flat against it. It was colder than the rest of the wall by enough that I noticed it without trying to notice it, and there was the faintest smell coming off the seam. Salt and old metal, the kind of smell you get below decks near the hull plating and nowhere else in the passenger areas. By the time I finished writing up the initial incident report, the on-call officer had come down to check on things, which is standard for anything involving hypothermia and an unclear cause. I told him what I had, plainly, the footage, the vitals, the salinity test, all of it, because that's my job, to report what I find, rather than what's comfortable. He listened without much reaction and then told me, in the tone people use when they're repeating something they've been told, rather than deciding it themselves, that the file should read cold exposure, contributing factor alcohol, cause undetermined, and that I shouldn't complicate the record further than that. He didn't say this had happened before. He didn't have to. The ease with which the sentence came out of him told me everything about how many times it had already been said, on other crossings, by other officers, to other nurses, standing in this exact office. I told him I'd document the objective findings accurately and let the conclusions stay open, because I wasn't going to write alcohol into a chart with a blood alcohol level of 0.0, and he didn't push it further than a look that told me he'd remember I'd said that. I don't know yet what that costs me. I wrote it anyway. It was almost 5 when the second call came in, from a cabin 4 doors down from Voss's, same side of the corridor, same original balcony line before the refit. A woman traveling with her husband had gotten up to use the bathroom and found her cabin mate soaked through and shaking on the floor of their own dry room, no memory past stepping out for a breath of air. I didn't need to check the deck plan on that one. I already knew what it used to be. Eleanor Voss was asleep by then, warmed, sedated, stable enough that I could leave her to check on the new patient without much worry. But on my way out, I heard her say something, half under the anesthetic, not fully awake, and not fully anywhere else either. She said, quite clearly, "Did they close the door again?" I hadn't told her anything about a door. Nobody had. The ship cleared that stretch of coordinates a little after 6, according to the position log, and no further calls came in before my shift ended at 7. I filed both reports the way I said I would. Findings only, conclusion left open, and I logged out and stood in the corridor on deck 6 for a minute, before I went to bed, looking at a wall that used to have a door in it. Before I left, I pulled the manifest out of habit, the way you check a chart one more time, even after you've already signed it. The return crossing leaves New York in 5 days. Same overnight route, same window of coordinates. Cabin 6142 is already booked for that leg. Different passenger. I haven't decided yet whether I'm the one who tells them.